September 28, 1943, Camp Clinton, Mississippi. Major General Henrik von Clossen stood in the processing office, his uniform still crisp with the insignia of high command, his posture rigid with the expectation of respect that rank had always commanded. Across the desk sat Brigadier General William Bradford, a Tennessee National Guard officer, whose calm eyes betrayed nothing. Von Clossen's voice was precise, his English flawless. "I require separate quarters, orderly service, and exemption from manual labor per my status as general officer." Bradford let the silence stretch, then gestured toward the window where rows of enlisted prisoners peeled potatoes under the autumn sun. "You will start tomorrow morning, 0600 hours. Bring gloves if your hands are soft." Before we continue this remarkable story, if you're enjoying this journey into history, hit that like button and subscribe to stay connected with stories that matter. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, whether you're in Texas or Tokyo. We love hearing from our community around the world. Your support keeps these forgotten moments of history alive. What happened next would become legendary in prisoner of war administration. Von Clossen had expected deference, protocol, the preservation of military hierarchy that the Geneva Convention seemed to guarantee. Instead, he found himself facing an American general who understood something profound about leadership, about transformation, about how to turn defeated enemies into men who might rebuild a shattered world. And in that moment, standing in that Mississippi office with the smell of peeled potatoes drifting through the window, Von Clossen realized that his war wasn't over. It was just beginning in a way he'd never imagined. Camp Clinton sprawled across former farmland in central Mississippi, holding 15,000 German prisoners captured in North Africa and Sicily. These were men who'd expected quick victory and found themselves instead on ships crossing the Atlantic toward detention in a country most had never imagined visiting. The facility operated under strict Geneva Convention protocols. Prisoners were fed adequately, housed in weatherproof barracks, allowed recreation and male privileges. But Bradford had developed a philosophy that went beyond mere compliance with international law. He believed that how these men spent their captivity would determine what kind of Germans they'd become when they finally went home. Von Clossen was 52 years old, Prussian aristocracy, career military, who'd commanded division level operations in North Africa until the Africa Corps collapsed in those chaotic final weeks of 1943. He carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to deference, to orderlies managing his needs, to enlisted men executing his requirements without question. He'd studied the Geneva Conventions at Military Academy, knew his rights intimately, and intended to exercise them fully. Officer-prisoners could not be compelled to work. They should receive treatment appropriate to their rank. Military hierarchy should be preserved even in detention. These weren't requests, they were legal entitlements. Bradford listened to Von Clossen's demands without interruption. Separate quarters away from enlisted prisoners, an orderly to manage personal needs, exemption from all work assignments, access to better food rations befitting officer status, permission to wear full uniform with insignia rather than standard prisoner clothing. The requests weren't technically unreasonable. Many POW camps did segregate officers, did provide certain privileges, did maintain military hierarchies that mirrored the structures prisoners had known before capture. But Bradford had observed something during 18 months of managing Camp Clinton. Segregating officers reinforced arrogance. Special treatment bred resentment among enlisted prisoners. Maintaining rigid hierarchies prevented the kind of attitude adjustment that made reintegration possible after the war ended. He'd seen officers who received privileges spend their detention years nursing grievances, reinforcing old certainties, learning nothing from defeat. And he'd decided that his camp would operate differently. General von Closen, Bradford said in his slow Tennessee drawl, choosing words carefully, the Geneva Conventions say I can't make you work. They don't say I have to give you special accommodations beyond basic humane treatment. You'll share barracks with other officers, not enlisted men, that much I'll grant. But you'll eat the same food, follow the same schedules, and participate in the same daily routines as every other prisoner in this camp. Von Closen's face flushed with anger. This is unacceptable. My rank entitles me to treatment befitting a general officer. I demand to speak with your superior, to lodge formal protest through proper channels. You're welcome to file complaints, Bradford replied evenly. But while those complaints work their way through channels, you'll live under the rules I just explained. Starting tomorrow at 0600, you'll report to the kitchen for work detail. We need potatoes peeled for 15,000 men. Your hands will be useful. The confrontation became an immediate test of wills. Von Closen refused to report for kitchen duty the next morning, remained in his bunk, waiting for guards to acknowledge the absurdity of expecting a general officer to perform menial labor alongside common soldiers. By 6:30, Bradford was standing beside his bunk, his expression showing neither anger nor particular concern, just the steady patience of someone who'd dealt with resistant prisoners before and understood that time was on his side. General, Bradford said, the title carrying slight ironic emphasis. You have two choices. You can come to the kitchen voluntarily and participate in the work that every able-bodied prisoner in this camp performs. Or you can remain here, in which case you'll receive no meals today, no recreation privileges, no access to the camp library or other amenities. Tomorrow, same choice, and the day after. You can be stubborn as long as you want, but you'll get hungry eventually. Von Closen stared at the ceiling, his jaw clenched, his body rigid with fury. He was being ordered around by an American general who probably hadn't even commanded in actual combat, who clearly didn't understand proper military hierarchy, who was violating every principle of how captured officers should be treated. But he was also 52 years old, his body already showing the effects of months of inadequate nutrition during the Afrika Korps' final campaigns. Hunger was not an abstract concept. It was immediate, physical, increasingly urgent as the day wore on without breakfast, without lunch. As evening approached and dinner smells wafted from the mess hall while he lay in his bunk, maintaining pointless resistance, Von Closen felt something shift. Not capitulation exactly, but pragmatic calculation. He could starve himself and protest, or he could peel potatoes and eat. Pride versus survival. Ideology versus practical necessity. By the third day he capitulated. He rose before dawn, dressed in standard prisoner work clothing, walked to the kitchen with the bearing of a man approaching his own execution. The kitchen supervisor, Sergeant Thomas Webb, handed him a peeler and a bucket. Around him, dozens of other prisoners, enlisted men, junior officers, a few NCOs worked in steady rhythm, their hands moving automatically through the repetitive task. You'll want to get a rhythm going, Webb said, demonstrating the efficient motion that minimized wasted energy. Try to keep the peels thin. We're not trying to waste good potato. And watch your fingers, especially if you're not used to this kind of work. Von Closen took a potato, began peeling with movements that were slow, awkward, inefficient. His hands, accustomed to signing orders and reviewing maps and all the abstract work of high command, struggled with the simple physical task that enlisted men executed without thought. Other prisoners watched covertly, aware that a general officer was performing labor that military tradition reserved for the lowest ranks. Their reactions varied. Some showed satisfaction at seeing an aristocratic officer reduced to their level. Others felt uncomfortable with this violation of military hierarchy they'd internalized. The autumn sun beat down on central Mississippi, turning the air thick and heavy. Inside the kitchen, the smell of peeled potatoes mixed with the ambient noise of institutional food preparation, the clatter of pots, the hiss of steam, the steady rhythm of blades against vegetable skin. Von Closen worked in silence, his mind oscillating between resentment and resignation, between fury at this degradation and pragmatic acceptance that resistance had proven futile. Over the following weeks, Von Closen continued reporting for kitchen duty, not because he'd accepted the legitimacy of Bradford's approach, but because hunger proved stronger than pride, because isolation without privileges made resistance unbearable, because pragmatism eventually overcame ideology when facing the daily choice between capitulation and suffering. But something unexpected began happening during those hours peeling potatoes. Von Closen found himself adjacent to enlisted prisoners he'd never have encountered in Germany's rigid military hierarchy, hearing their conversations, learning their perspectives, beginning to understand the war from viewpoints that had been invisible when he'd occupied positions of command. Corporal Franz Weber, a Bavarian farmer drafted in 1940, worked beside him peeling potatoes. He spoke with quiet resignation, having followed orders without belief. "Before the war, I grew potatoes to feed my family," he said. "Then I was sent to steal land in Africa. Now I'm back to potatoes, a prisoner. Seen whole, the circle feels pointless." Von Closen didn't respond immediately, uncertain how to engage with such direct questioning of the war's purpose. In Germany's military culture, junior ranks didn't speak to generals this way, didn't express doubt or philosophical musings that suggested questioning of official objectives. "War has purposes beyond individual understanding," Von Closen finally said, offering the standard formulation he'd given subordinates who'd expressed doubts. "Soldiers serve larger strategies, trust leadership, to pursue national interests that may not be apparent at tactical levels." Weber nodded, skepticism etched on his face. "Maybe, or maybe we followed orders because questioning was dangerous. The system was built to stop us from thinking. Here peeling potatoes, no one watching, no punishment for honesty, I can finally say what I never could. I think we fought for nothing, died for nothing, destroyed our country and others." The words lingered, raw and unsettling. Von Closen had no reply that didn't sound hollow. Bradford tracked Von Closen's adjustment through guard reports and quiet visits. He saw efficiency replace resistance, conversation replace hauteur, shared labor steadily eroding rank and distance. In November, Bradford summoned him. Von Closen entered braced for reprimand, but Bradford was cordial coffee, a chair, conversation, instead of discipline. "I've heard good things," Bradford said. "You work well. You don't resist anymore." "I adapted," Von Closen replied. "You made resistance pointless." "That's fair," Bradford said. "But understand this wasn't humiliation. It was strategy. I could preserve hierarchy, erase it entirely, or make privilege something earned. I chose the third. For what purpose?" "I'm not just holding you until the war ends," Bradford said. "I'm trying to send men back capable of rebuilding Germany. That means questioning corrupt authority. Obedience isn't virtue. No man is inherently superior. You think potatoes teach that?" "Working beside former subordinates teaches humility," Bradford said. "Equality changes perspective." By winter, von Closen had integrated into camp life, still an officer, but increasingly reflective, questioning beliefs once considered unassailable. Von Closen spoke carefully. "I believed good soldiers follow orders, that hierarchy ensures coordination. But working beside men I once commanded, hearing their views, I wonder if my obedience was virtue or cowardice. If leadership means more than efficient execution." Another officer objected. "Without obedience, armies fall into chaos." "Perhaps armies that require blind obedience shouldn't function," von Closen replied, surprised by himself. "The Americans allowed discussion, judgment, and they defeated us." In March, news arrived of his mother's death. A brief Red Cross telegram. No details, just absence. That evening, Bradford found him alone, watching the Mississippi sunset. "I heard about your mother," he said softly. "I'm sorry. Losing a parent is hard. Losing them from so far away I can't imagine." Von Closen nodded, but didn't speak immediately, his throat tight with emotion. "She didn't approve of my career," he finally said, his voice quiet. "She wanted me to stay on the family estate, to manage the lands as my father had, to live a quiet life rather than commanding men in combat. We argued when I chose military academy, but as I rose in rank, earned recognition, she softened, began to take pride in her son, the general." He paused, his hands clenched together. "Now that nation is destroyed, that service proven worthless, that pride shown to be misplaced. And she died without knowing whether I survived capture, without final conversation where I might have admitted she was right." Bradford let the words settle. "My father was a farmer too. He wanted me to stay, work the land, continue the family line. I disappointed him by joining the National Guard, by choosing a military life he thought pointless. He died in 1940. Before this war, before I took command of this camp, I think he might have been proud eventually, but I'll never know. And that uncertainty never leaves you." They sat in silence, enemy generals bound by shared regret and the universal experience of disappointing parents while pursuing paths that once felt necessary. By summer 1944, von Closen had become an informal leader among German officers at Camp Clinton. Not by appointment, but by trust. His leadership had changed. Less autocratic, more consultative. He organized work fairly, represented prisoner concerns, and encouraged open discussion. Bradford watched with quiet satisfaction. Denying special privileges and forcing shared labor had not broken von Closen, it had reshaped him. Leadership, he learned, came from service, not rank. In August, Bradford summoned him for a familiar meeting. After routine matters, Bradford asked, "If I'd given you everything you demanded, comfort, exemption, what kind of man would you be now?" "The same," von Closen said. "Still believing rank entitled me to deference. I would have learned nothing. And instead, I peeled potatoes beside men I once commanded. I heard their stories, I questioned beliefs I'd held for decades. You humiliated me, he admitted softly, but you also educated me. Bradford shook his head. Comfort preserves illusions. Equality destroys them. Repatriated in 1946, von Closen returned to a Germany where his title meant nothing. He settled in Hamburg, teaching history and ethics to displaced children, emphasizing moral courage over obedience. In letters to Bradford, he reflected on Camp Clinton and the humiliation that became his education. You taught me through the simplest method, by making me experience what my own soldiers experienced, he wrote in 1950. I had commanded men to perform labor I considered beneath me, had expected deference based on rank rather than earning respect through character. Your refusal to grant me special treatment forced me to discover that I had no inherent superiority, that rank was just social construction, that defeat had rendered meaningless, that genuine leadership required serving alongside those you lead, rather than commanding from an elevated position. He became an advocate for military reform in West Germany, arguing that the new Bundeswehr should break from Prussian traditions, should emphasize moral education alongside tactical training, should teach soldiers that obedience has limits, that following orders doesn't absolve individuals from responsibility for their actions. In 1963, he traveled to Mississippi to visit Bradford to see Camp Clinton, which had been converted to different purposes, but still existed as the physical space where his transformation had occurred. They toured the facility together, two old generals remembering the confrontation that had begun with von Closen, demanding privileges, and Bradford refusing them. They visited the kitchen where von Closen had peeled potatoes, now serving different purposes, but still recognizable. He stood where he'd worked 20 years earlier, remembering the anger and humiliation, the gradual adjustment, the conversations with enlisted men that had challenged his assumptions about hierarchy and worth. I hated you for months, von Closen admitted, standing in that kitchen. I thought you were cruel, vindictive, that you were violating Geneva Conventions and my rights as an officer. I filed formal complaints through the Red Cross, demanded that higher authorities override your decisions. I was certain that when superiors reviewed your approach, they would order you to provide the special treatment I deserved. And when they didn't, Bradford asked, smiling, I began to wonder if I had been wrong, if special treatment was not a right, but a privilege granted by a system built to preserve hierarchy. If your refusal to grant privileges, your insistence on shared labor, and your treatment of me as an equal rather than a superior were not cruel, but honest, more moral, more aligned with human dignity than the aristocratic order I had accepted without question. Bradford died in 1970. His obituary mentioned his service at camp. Clinton but failed to capture his radical approach to POW management, detention, as education rather than containment. Von Closen attended the funeral, traveling from Germany to Tennessee to honor the man who denied him privilege, and in doing so gave him something more valuable, the realization that rank was a social construction, not proof of inherent worth. Speaking at the service, von Closen said, General Bradford taught me leadership by refusing to treat me as a leader. He taught humility by denying privilege. He forced me to question authority by exercising his own. I learned through peeling potatoes, through working beside men I once commanded, through discovering that stripped of rank, I possessed no natural superiority. At Camp Clinton's former site, now an industrial park, a historical marker lists prisoner numbers, farm labor, and Geneva Convention compliance. It does not mention the German general who demanded special treatment or the American general who sent him to the kitchen. That story survives in letters, memoirs, and testimony. Von Closen peeled potatoes from 1943 to 1946, thousands of them. They fed 15,000 prisoners. But they also transformed one man, dissolving certainty into humility. The war ended, the prisoners went home. The lesson remained that leadership requires shared burden, that hierarchy is not natural law, and that sometimes the most revolutionary act is refusing to treat anyone as special.